Hey everybody. Over the past several months, I have been immersed in the world of Stephen King short stories and Stephen King short fiction with the intent and the goal of revisiting every single short story collection, reading and rating every single story to ultimately rate every collection and then rank them against each other at some point in the future. That's my goal. That's what I'm working towards. So I started with You Like It Darker because it was the new book. I picked it up, I read it, I was taking notes about the stories as I went, and then decided to go all the way back to the beginning with Night Shift, which I covered in another video not too long ago. Well, the time has come to move on to Stephen King's second collection, Skeleton Crew. So in this video, I'm going to be rating all the stories in Skeleton Crew, talking about first appearances, giving some general thoughts, and then ultimately we'll assign a score to Skeleton Crew, and I will let you know where it stacks up in terms of the collections that I have read and reviewed so far. So Stephen King's first collection, Night Shift, is vital. It's essential Stephen King. It's entertaining, it's grisly, it's gory. From a historical perspective, it is essential Stephen King in that a lot of the content was written before he was Stephen King. Back in those days, before he had published Carrie, his family was just trying to get by. And so a lot of the stories kind of betray that sense of, him sitting in a laundry room in a trailer, just hammering out an idea to try to create a story that he could sell to, let's face it, porn magazines, and make some quick money to help support his family. So Night Shift covers a lot of that ground. The stories are lean, they're mean, none of them are too long, and the collection overall is pretty uniform. Well, in contrast, Skeleton Crew there are a couple of stories that are from the early days, but most of the content was written and published after the publication of Night Shift, when Stephen King was a well-established, if not necessarily legendary and iconic author yet, was certainly a well-established and popular one, and writing for money, writing quickly to sell quickly was no longer a concern. And as a result, the stories in Skeleton Crew are more luxuriant. They take their time. They much more, to me, reflect Stephen King's mature writing style, when he could write for the love of writing and truly follow his muse, as opposed to having to bash something out that he could sell quickly and make some quick money. So like I mentioned, Night Shift is pretty regimented, pretty structured. None of the stories are too long, and they just kind of line up all in a row. 25, 35 pages, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, just bam, 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 bam through the entire collection. Well, Skeleton Crew is much more varied. So just looking at the table of contents, you notice that the collection starts off with a novella. The collection also includes a couple of poems, which is something that Night Shift did not include. There's also not as many grisly monster stories as Night Shift. So Night Shift, everything runs amok. Machines run amok, people run amok, and I think it speaks to Stephen King as a young man thinking, what can I write? What inspiration do I have, and what do I know will sell and be popular in these porno magazines that I'm selling my work in? Skeleton Crew it does have some grisly monsters. It does have it has its fair share of blah kind of moments, but overall, even the supernatural themed stories, I think, are not that they're more subdued. I would say that they're more mature. And that's not to say anything negative about Night Shift. I think it just speaks to that point where Stephen King was in his life, where he had the luxury of writing just every day. That was his job, and he could take as long as he needed to take to do the job right, without exception. And that is reflected in at least the more recent content in Skeleton Crew. Skeleton Crew also speaks to Stephen King's growingly diverse appeal, whereas Night Shift, like I've said a couple of times already, The stories either were previously unpublished or they had been published previously in porno magazines, Cavalier being the most prevalent example of that. Skeleton Crew has stories that first appeared in magazines like Redbook. So it has stories that appeared in Gallery, which was a men's magazine, but also that appeared in Redbook. So it speaks to Stephen King's growing acceptance and mainstream appeal by this point in his career in the early to mid 80s. So right out of the gate, I stressed, probably more than I should have, about the challenge of rating this collection. How do you rate these things against each other when they are as diverse as comparing a novella, and an excellent novella at that, to a poem? My initial inclination was to consider The Mist separately as its own thing and leave the poems out altogether. Because to me, you know, can you really compare Skeleton Crew to something like Different Seasons? Because Different Seasons has 4 long stories. They're able to build a world and really sink in. And The Mist, I think, should be rated and ranked against the novellas. And I will do something like that someday. And then the poems, I mean, it's like a couple of paragraphs, and some of them, there's 2 poems, and one of them tries to be sinister, and one of them is pretty precious and cutesy. And I thought, well, I'm rating the short stories, right? Or am I rating the collections? And what I had to decide was, I decided that I was rating the collections. And ultimately, Stephen King decided to include these things in Skeleton Crew, so I will rate them and add their scores to the final overall score. As with Night Shift, I base my ratings on how well the story is crafted and how much of an emotional impact it makes. So for instance, a rating of 6 or 7 likely indicates that the story is entertaining, it's generally well written, but it strains credulity. It's not resolved in a satisfying or believable manner, and it isn't emotionally engaging. An 8 could be a good story, well written, that doesn't quite hang together from a craft perspective. A 9 is a story that is incredibly well constructed, well written, great concept, but somehow not emotionally engaging. Now, a 10 is well constructed, well written, it has a great concept, and it makes me truly care for the characters, which is no mean feat in a short fiction word count. So like, over the 1,100 pages of it, boy, I really grew to care for those kids, for the Losers Club. But there was all that. It took me weeks to read that for the first time. But can that similar type of emotional resonance be created in a 40-page short story? Well, we'll see as we go through the ratings. So we start at the beginning. And of course, right at the beginning of Skeleton Crew is The Mist, which was originally published in the collection Dark Forces in 1980. I believe it was revised before it was published in Skeleton Crew, as Stephen King was in the habit of doing. It is the longest story by far in the collection. It's not a short story, it is firmly a novella. And in a world where Stephen King can publish Elevation as a novel, The Mist could have easily, as I said, been taken and published on its own as a standalone novel under Stephen King's name, and been completely respectable and done quite well and been very, very famous in his overall bibliography. But it was included in a collection initially, and it's included in Skeleton Crew as well. The Mist reminds me of The Stand and Under the Dome. It's about how people react to apocalyptic scenarios. It's just in microcosm. Whereas The Stand is literally the whole world, and Under the Dome is an entire town. The Mist is like one piece, one pocket. Mostly it is the world of this grocery store. And I think it's brilliant what Stephen King does in The Mist. It's far scarier to describe the uncertainty, the unknowable things that are happening off screen, so to speak, that we can't see, we can only hear and wonder about. than it would be to have everything as clear as day and see all of the horrible things clearly. I think the story would have been far weaker had Stephen King tried to do that. So by creating this mist that presses in on all of the people in the story that are inside this one location, truly creates like the tiniest yet microcosm of the apocalypse, and one of the best in Stephen King's long career. Whereas The Stand and Under the Dome are two of Stephen King's longest novels, by comparison, The Mist is remarkably efficient, and that is definitely one of the things that I really, really like about it, as those other two stories are really, really stuffed full, stuffed to the gills. The Mist covers similar territory, but does it much more efficiently. The Mist is yet another entry into Stephen King's fear of the government, fear of military secrets subgenre, and also sort of an entry into this niche in Stephen King's writing of man messing with forces outside of our control. So man's hubris gone awry. We think we can handle it. We think we're masters of the universe, and someone flips a switch somewhere, and suddenly, not unlike The Stand and sort of in a way Under the Dome, we are left to deal with the consequences of our own hubris. The Mist also features one of Stephen King's all-time great villains, and he does villains, and he does villains with a religious bent. And Mrs. Carmody is one of the all-time great villains. She's also one of the all-time great religious nuts in the Stephen King universe. I think Mrs. Carmody is an interesting commentary on religious belief and fanaticism, and the natural gravitation that we feel toward answers and belief in a time of crisis. So the whole thing is in microcosm, but over the course of the story, more and more people in the grocery store, as time wears on, their defenses wear down, and they start to kind of gravitate toward Mrs. Carmody. At first, this is something Stephen King does so well in the story. So just the normal order of things just slowly but surely starts to break down, including people not wanting to get out of line at the grocery store because it's rude and it's impolite, to eventually at the end complete and utter fanatical, like religious mania and cultural breakdown thanks to Mrs. Carmody. She's one of the all-time great villains, and I'm really fond of her. The Mist also has an excellent open-ended ending that leaves a lot of uncertainty, which I think is perfect for everything that's gone before. So the whole story is full of uncertainty. You don't know what's going on. You don't know what the monsters are that are out there. And Stephen King gives these tantalizing glimpses. And I think it would be inappropriate for the story if he tried to wrap everything up definitively. But instead, he leaves it open-ended. And it's basically a hopeless ending. I think in the movie adaptation of The Mist, it was a very explicitly, totally hopeless ending. Well, Stephen King has a mostly hopeless ending, but in classic Stephen King fashion, he does leave a tiny ray of light and a tiny shred of hope at the end of the story. There are some truly awe-inspiring scenes once the main group leaves the grocery store, particularly as they're driving down the highway and they're experiencing, kind of getting flashes of some of these creatures and monsters that have entered our world. I just remember being in awe of some of the descriptions, and it was a great way, sort of a climax, a pinnacle of this excellent story. The Mist is a highlight of Stephen King's entire bibliography. If it had been published on its own, I think as a novel, that novel would rank amongst the classics. It would fit right in with the classics from the 70s and 80s. It gets Skeleton Crew started with a huge bang, and I give it a 10 out of 10. And then following The Mist, we go pretty heavily in the opposite direction with Here There Be Tygers. And this is from the spring 1968 edition of Ubris, which was the University of Maine literary art magazine. So this was Stephen King's contribution, and one of his earliest pieces that was written either when he was in high school or when he was in college. After the pinnacle of The Mist, the collection really plummets back to earth with Here There Be Tygers. To me, it's an example of juvenilia. I don't know exactly when Stephen King wrote it, but if I found out that he wrote it when he was like 12 years old, I wouldn't really be surprised. It's okay, but it's totally forgettable. And I don't know, I kind of wish that it hadn't been included in the collection, to be honest, but it was. And, overall, it doesn't sink the collection. But I give Here There Be Tygers a 4 out of 10. So next up we have The Monkey, which is a famous image related to Skeleton Crew because it was the image used on the cover artwork of the sinister mechanical monkey with its cymbals ready to crash. And of course, if you've read the story, you know what happens when the cymbals start crashing. The Monkey was first published in the November 1980 issue of Gallery magazine. It's a great example, and there were several of these in Night Shift, but it's a great example of Stephen King's ability to take something totally benign and turn it into something horrific. He, at some point, all the things, like if there's creepy potential with anything in daily life, I think Stephen King has realized it, has pondered it, and has turned it into art. And those mechanical monkeys are pretty creepy. So Stephen King, being a normal person, was probably creeped out by them as well and turned it into this really interesting and engaging story. It builds great atmosphere and suspense despite the outrageous and, in some ways, ridiculous premise. It transcends the ridiculousness of its premise to create something truly suspenseful and truly memorable in the best Stephen King tradition. I give The Monkey 8 out of 10. So next up we have another story that was initially published in the spring 1968 issue of Ubris, and that is Cain Rose Up. So while it was published in the same magazine as Here There Be Tygers, the two pieces feel worlds apart. I think, like I said, Tygers to me feels like juvenilia. Cain is much more laser focused. It's much more mature. It achieves, to me, truly chilling effect in its utter normalcy. The normalcy of the antagonist, the normalcy of the situation. The antagonist, something's going on. He's having a breakdown, or he's had a breakdown. He's preparing to do terrible things, but it just comes across leading up to the horror at the end of the story. Everything is very normal. Everything is very mundane. And I think that's what gives the story its great power. I can only imagine the reaction it got at the University of Maine, where Stephen King was a student. Anyone who read the story and was like, I mean, if you've seen pictures of Stephen King when he was in college, he was a pretty distinctive looking character that may have turned some heads back in the day. And then you read the story about a normal seeming everyday young man who, decides to take out his rifle and start killing people from his dorm room window. It must have turned some heads back in the day. Cain Rose Up is one of the shorter pieces in the collection, and it's one of the first that I can remember reading when I was a kid, when one of my main motivators for picking Stephen King stories or novels was page count and my confidence that I would realistically finish the story that I started. So for that reason, I read Cain Rose Up very, very early on, and I enjoyed it then as well, and I still enjoy it today. And I give Cain Rose Up 8 out of 10. Next up, we have Mrs. Todd's Shortcut, which was published initially in the May 1984 issue of Red Book magazine, of all places. Red Book magazine. It doesn't get much more mainstream than that. Mrs. Todd's Shortcut, to me, is the first classic Maine story in the collection. There's been precious little of that. Maine is Stephen King's stock and trade, and The Mist is set in Maine, but it's definitely supernatural. It's bigger, and it could be set anywhere. But Mrs. Todd's Shortcut is the first piece in Skeleton Crew, or really Night Shift for that matter, that has that classic Stephen King main feel. It feels incredibly familiar and comfortable, like coming home. It's the first story in the collection that I can recall that has all the yeah, just that classic Stephen King Maine, New England vernacular that he's so that is so familiar to the constant readers. I really, like, right out of the gate, I liked Mrs. Todd Shortcut as a piece of work. Mrs. Todd Shortcut has wonderful writing and like this liquid, smooth transition from mystery to suspense and finally to awe. There's a mystery enough in the heart of the story that it makes you want to keep reading or listening to find out what happens. And then a glimpse of horror, supernatural, a little bit, not too much. And then finally, just this like awe-inspiring feeling by the end. It's truly remarkable what Stephen King can accomplish in such a short page count here. I really liked with Mrs. Todd Shortcut, like in the best Stephen King, the science fiction elements are grounded in a realistic setting, which I think makes them even more effective. When you consider something that is so out of the ordinary in the context of our ordinary world, it becomes truly chilling. And Mrs. Todd Shortcut does a good job with this. I give Mrs. Todd Shortcut a 10 out of 10. I think I would definitely stack it up if I was making a Stephen King short fiction greatest hits collection. Mrs. Todd Shortcut would definitely be one of the greatest hits. I give it a 10 out of 10. Next up is The Jaunt, and The Jaunt was first published in the June 1981 issue of Twilight Zone magazine. So I think if I had a lot of scientific knowledge, if I was an astronaut or if I was a physicist, I would probably, reading The Jaunt would probably be like listening to someone scrape their fingernails down a chalkboard. But as I am just your average kind of simple person and have very little advanced scientific knowledge, I did find it easy to get caught up in the story of The Jaunt. It asks the immortal question, what is the cost of progress and is it worth it? Which kind of made me think of where we are right now with AI. It's jumping leaps and bounds. It's progressing faster than we have the ability to regulate it or truly to understand it. And the Jaunt was one of those types of things, a tremendous scientific breakthrough with extreme value in popular culture and just in the way we live our lives. So it was pushed into production. But as the story progresses, we start to learn a bit more about the cost of that progress. And this is where the Jaunt truly comes into its own. Stephen King does a great job of building this kind of sick, foreboding feeling, and it just keeps slowly ratcheting up throughout the story. It's fascinating, the recounting of how the Jaunt itself was developed in the first place. This could be one of the more tedious parts of the story in lesser hands, but I really, really enjoyed that part of the story. It has a horrifying climax, although not a particularly surprising one. I did feel like I kind of saw it coming. And that's not just because I had read the story before years and years ago. It kind of broadcasted for a while. And that's totally okay. It does have a satisfying conclusion, just not a necessarily surprising one. And it doesn't really get me all emotionally involved, just more intellectually curious and interested. It's a fine story, not a classic one, but a fine one, and I give it 8 out of 10.
And now a word about our sponsor.
Did you know that StephenKingCollector.com has an entire gallery dedicated to remarks? It's true, and it's remarkable. So if you're not aware, a remark is a custom one-of-a-kind piece of artwork that an artist can put directly into a book. It's a really interesting way to make a special book truly world-class and one-of-a-kind. I've seen remarks that are very small and quick and just like done in pencil. I've seen remarks that are 2 pages wide, full color, absolutely beautiful. But the most important thing with a remark is that it's unique. That book is just yours. There's nothing else like it in the world. And as such a personal thing, you can imagine that there are remarked books all over the place that nobody but the artist and the owner of the book have ever seen. Well, Thomas at The Collector has created a gallery on his page, and he solicits remarks, images of remarks. So if you have a remarked book, you can take a picture of the remark, send it to Thomas, and he will put it on the gallery on the site. And there are many, many, many artists that are represented, including such heavy hitters as Glenn Chadbourne, Dave Christensen, Ned Dameron, Phil Hale, Don Mates, Eli John, Dave McKean, Michael Whelan, and many, many more. So if you're like me, you love Stephen King related artwork, and it is fascinating to see these custom one-of-a-kind remarks. So it's not comprehensive, it's not exhaustive. There's got to be dozens, if not hundreds, of remarks out there that the owners are more than happy to keep on their shelves and enjoy themselves. And that is perfectly fine. But head on over to The Collector. I'll put the link in the description for this video, and you can check out all of this artwork from across Stephen King's entire career. And it's really cool. You should go check it out. Next up, we have The Wedding Gig, which was first published in the December 1980 issue of Ellery Queen's Mystery magazine. So this is a historical fiction, and I really liked the Prohibition setting and the period details. This is kind of a unique thing for Stephen King by this point to go back so far into the past, and I thought he pulled it off really well. It's was surprisingly funny. I wasn't expecting to find it so amusing, but mostly in the descriptions of the differences between the man and the wife in the story, it was actually quite funny. And then in the second half becomes surprisingly poignant. The portion, I thought it was an interesting way that Stephen King put the story together. So after what you would normally consider to be the climax of the piece, about halfway through, the story keeps going and kind of evolves into something different and becomes surprisingly poignant and kind of sentimental as it goes, which I wasn't expecting. And then finally, at the end, oddly uplifting. I mean, it's not really a happy story, but it is kind of oddly uplifting at the end. So it covers a lot of emotional ground, which I was really impressed with. And even though it is emotionally engaging, I think it's not necessarily like the best crafted or the most fluidly written. So ultimately, I give The Wedding Gig 8 out of 10. Next up, we have the first poem, and this was previously unpublished, and the poem is called Paranoid, a Chant. So Paranoid, at least, is on point thematically with the rest of the collection. It creates some really vivid images, not unlike Stephen King's poem, The Dark Man, which was eventually released as a standalone release by Cemetery Dance. It creates some very Stephen King-esque images in very, very few words. And I did enjoy it. I'm not a huge poetry fan, but I thought that Paranoid was fine. I mean, it's not a classic. I could take it or leave it in the collection, but it's in the collection, and I liked it just fine. I give Paranoid a 5 out of 10. It's not hugely memorable, but again, it is vivid and it's enjoyable for what it is while you are reading it. Next up is The Raft, which was first published in the November 1982 issue of Gallery magazine. This was another early read for me as a kid. I don't remember what school year I was in, 5th grade, 6th grade. I remember reading The Raft on my long school bus ride home from school. It's another one of those stories that kind of throws back to what Night Shift does so many times and just kind of creates a thing, and it's an inexplicable thing, and it's dangerous and it's scary, and it's never truly explained. It just is. And the human characters in the story have to deal with this thing that just is. So it's one of those stories that Stephen King does over and over, sometimes with varying degrees of success. It reminded me of Nightmare on Elm Street in the sense that the characters in the story can never afford to let their guard down. And as the story progresses, that becomes more and more exhausting, more and more overwhelming, until you just are almost filled with this sense of despair for the situation itself, because it truly seems hopeless. And spoiler alert, it totally is. The Raft has some of the most truly, like, cringe inducing in the best possible way, gruesome scenes in the entire collection, as the teenage horn dogs are consumed one by one by the entity. I was like literally wincing, because it's horrible and it's so gruesome, but it's also delightful, and it's classic Stephen King, and you can feel like he's having a good time contemplating what would actually happen to a human body were it to be pulled inexorably through a knothole in a board. So we're going to say that's possible. How could you get a human body through a knothole in a board? And Stephen King, you can tell he's enjoying that challenge of describing what that would be, and it comes across very, very vividly in the story. I did think there was one really strange kind of tonal misstep in the story, and that's toward the end of the story. There's the two final characters, Randy and Laverne, after everything they've been through, after as exhausted and grimy and dirty and terrified and just nasty as the whole situation is, they decide to, go ahead and have sex, and in the midst of everything that is going on, they just decide to get it on. They can't resist each other after freezing in their freaking underwear all night long on this raft. Just, what are you gonna say? Teenage libido. It can't be quenched. Even though the entire story has a lot of horny teen energy, with the bodies of the young people being described in detail, potentially with Stephen King's understanding that the story would eventually be sold to a porn magazine. By the time the scene happens on the raft, the sex scene with Randy and Laverne, it's really just about the least sexy environment and situation I could possibly imagine. And I thought it was very gratuitous. Potentially, the scene wasn't initially there. This idea is just coming to me. Maybe Stephen King wrote the story without it. He submitted it to Gallery Magazine, and they were like, come on, you've described the boobs, you've described the boners. You've got to get two of these characters together. They've got to have sex, no matter how ridiculous, no matter how unsexy the situation. I don't know. Was it editorial feedback, or was it Stephen King's own initiative that put that scene in the story? I don't know. But regardless, it is kind of an odd misstep in what's overall a pretty tight and creepy story. It does have a good, vague ending. It leaves things kind of open-ended, which I always appreciate. I give The Raft 7 out of 10. Next up is Word Processor of the Gods, which was initially published in the January 1983 issue of Playboy magazine. Word Processor has an absolutely delightful premise. It's like the writer's version of the genie in the bottle giving 3 wishes. It's yet another entry into this huge Stephen King subgenre of writing as world building and writers as gods. And it's one of the best, in my opinion. It's one of my favorites. It's a classic Stephen King short story, and I give Word Processor of the Gods a 10 out of 10. Absolutely essential. If you don't read anything else in Skeleton Crew, you should put Word Processor of the Gods high on your list. Next up is The Man Who Would Not Shake Hands, which was initially published in the 1981 collection Shadows 4. So The Man Who Would Not Shake Hands immediately reminds me of the breathing method from different seasons, and seems to be written about the same time, about the same club and the same group of people. So I could see Stephen King knocks out the breathing method, which was the most recent one before Different Seasons was published, and then just keeps going. Or like he says, he had enough gas in the tank to knock out one more story, and it ended up being The Man Who Would Not Shake Hands. So it even has the same structure as the breathing method. It's a nestled story, or a nested story, a story within a story. It's an interesting mystery. It is well written. My curiosity was piqued, but it ends with kind of this low-key twist that left me thinking like, well, okay, that's it, I guess. So it didn't quite carry the promise through. I give The Man Who Would Not Shake Hands a 7 out of 10. Next up is Beachworld, which was first published in the fall 1984 issue of Weird Tales. I liked the science fiction concept of Beachworld. I did appreciate it. It really builds a true sense of desperation and isolation. In the best Stephen King tradition, his writing and world building make the shift into the outrageous perfectly believable. And Beachworld has a great sort of shift into like, whoa, what the heck? It also has a nice, bleak ending. Overall, there's nothing wrong with it. It just, didn't really capture my imagination or trigger my emotions. I give Beachworld a 7 out of 10. Next up is another one of the really early stories that's captured in Skeleton Crew, and that's The Reaper's Image, which was first published in the spring 1969 issue of Startling Mystery Stories, one of Stephen King's very first published stories. So really cool, really interesting addition to Skeleton Crew. He started the story at the age of 18 before he even began college. So really, really early on in his life. I think The Reaper's Image has an interesting concept, but it's not really fully fleshed out or developed. It was hard for me to tell exactly what was happening in the story and also to tell why I should care about it. It didn't make too much of a lasting impression. It's decent. I mean, it's head and tails well beyond anything I certainly was writing at the age of 18, or probably at the age of 40 some odd that I am now. But still, in the context of Skeleton Crew, it doesn't stand out as one of the best or one of the classics. So I give it a 6 out of 10. Next up is Nona, which was originally published in the 1978 collection Shadows. This is an interesting kind of doomed love affair story, kind of like a miniature version of Bonnie and Clyde or something like that. It has a nice Maine setting again, and there's a really interesting and gripping sense of desperation and hopelessness in the characters. And I thought that maybe it was intended, maybe not, but the blizzard in the story that keeps growing and growing was, I thought, a nice metaphor for the duo's swiftly reducing options. So as the snow progresses, their situation gets more and more desperate. Their options get less and less as the visibility drops and all of that. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but as I was reading the story, I thought, okay, I think that's pretty clever. I thought it also had a nice twist ending. I wouldn't say that it's an all-time classic, but it's a fine story, and I give Nona an 8 out of 10. Next up is another poem, the second poem out of 2 in the collection, previously unpublished, and that's called For Owen. The best thing I can say about For Owen is that it's cute, but it feels completely and utterly out of place in the context of the book. It's hard to muster up enough energy to really hate or dislike the poem, but I read it. I was like, all right, well, that's that. It's over. I give For Owen a 2 out of 10. Next up is Survivor Type, which was originally published in the 1982 collection Terrors. So Survivor Type has a hilarious, gross out concept. There's I think Stephen King is having lots of fun with the concept and lots of fun maybe grossing himself out in telling the story. But it's not the best written or the most enjoyable story despite the entertaining premise. The fatal flaw of Survivor Type is that it's really a one-trick pony. And to me, I think it hangs around too long. And I don't know how best to describe it, but it's odd. It somehow simultaneously goes too far with while not going far enough. I don't know if that makes any sense. If you've read Survivor Type, maybe that resonates with you, maybe not. I didn't think the story was entirely successful, despite the entertaining premise and the obvious glee that Stephen King gets in exploring the premise. So I give Survivor Type 6 out of 10. So we're kind of in a lull in the back half of the collection, with some stories that are fine, but not great and not particularly memorable. So we move on to Uncle Otto's Truck, which was first published in the October 1983 issue of Yankee magazine. It's another machinery run amok story, which Night Shift has so many of that are done so vividly and so memorably. I think Uncle Otto's Truck is good at building suspense, but the concept really starts to stretch thin after a while. It is, to me, too long, but not without its nice moments. It does have some nice moments. It kind of reminded me of the Sundog from Four Past Midnight, in that it just goes so slowly and is so ridiculous, and it just draws the thing out for so long that I get annoyed with it in a way. Uncle Otto's Truck does have some nice moments, but I give it a 6 out of 10. Then we move on to Morning Deliveries, Milkman #1, which was previously unpublished. It's fragmentary. It is, I think, actually a fragment of a much longer narrative. And so it's a piece of a much longer thing that never came to fruition, but it holds together as a single nasty jolt of a story. The concept is solid, and it really does bear fleshing out, but there's also a sense that the story wouldn't bear the weight of added details. Like, I want there to be more to explore with this character in this world, but if Stephen King dragged it out and tried to put more meat on the bones than they could actually hold, the whole thing would fall apart. So it is what it is. It's decent. I give it a 6 out of 10. Then we move on to the other fragment of the same longer piece, Big Wheels, A Tale of the Laundry Game, Milkman #2, which was originally published in the 1980 collection New Terrors. This one, rather than feeling like a nasty little jolt, it does hold together and feels like a chapter, like a whole chapter from a much longer work, which it sort of is, but as I understand it, the longer work doesn't exist. The main characters in the story are really hard to like and relate to. It's an example, kind of like Children of the Corn, where you hope something terrible happens to the characters and you end up rooting for the bad guy. I definitely had that sense of like, I really, really hate these people. Am I supposed to root for them as the main characters? Because come on, bad guy, let's get these people dead and out of the way, because they were very annoying and hard to relate to. I give Big Wheels 6 out of 10. And the collection is sequenced really well, and the last 3 stories really pick up the pace and end the collection on a high note. So next we have Gramma, which was from the spring 1984 issue of Weird Book. Gramma is one that I didn't remember from when I was a kid, but truly one of the scariest things that Stephen King has ever written. He taps in the story, he taps into a unique kind of fear. Literally had my heart racing. It reminded me, somehow tapped into something, suppressed memories, repressed memories from my childhood, and that sense of just utter horror that you can feel as a child when confronted with something that you don't understand that seems really scary. The story deflates a small bit at the end when the supernatural element is introduced as a means to explain what is going on. If I had one disappointment with Gramma, it's that Stephen King tries to explain what was going on. This would be a story, I think, that would benefit from an ambiguous kind of unexplained ending. But that is redeemed by another solid, although slightly predictable, twist ending. I really, really liked Gramma. I can't reiterate enough how scary this story is. Really, really unique. Like really, really chilling stuff. And I give Gramma a 9 out of 10. Then we move on to the Ballad of the Flexible Bullet, which originally appeared in the June 1984 issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. This is another story about writing. Stephen King has written a lot of stories about writing and featured a lot of writer characters. This one is brilliant and very amusing, and I really, really liked it. It's another one that's very well written and just smoothly draws you into the story and the evolving mystery, and introduces the science fiction elements really well, just without even realizing it. It's one of those like Stephen King stories that you just kind of fall into. You can't help it. It's very, very smooth and organic. It believably ratchets up the tension even as things get harder to believe. So while the suspension of disbelief element gets greater and greater and greater, the writing is so smooth that it balances out and he just draws you in. That's something that at his best he does really well. Maybe nobody does that better than Stephen King. It's an excellent, classic, greatest hit kind of Stephen King short story, and I give it 10 out of 10. And then finally, we end the collection with The Reach, which was originally published in the November 1981 issue of Yankee magazine. I think The Reach was a brilliant choice for the final story in the collection. It's a very powerful ending to an overall excellent, iconic collection. It ends everything on a note of hope. It feels very, very Maine and therefore very personal to Stephen King. I don't know if it is personal to him, but anything Maine kind of, and about the people and the culture of Maine can't help but feel personal when it comes to Stephen King. So it's about this. I love this idea. A 95-year-old woman who has lived her whole life on an island, and she's never left the island, never gone to the mainland because she simply never saw any reason to. I love that. That is classic Stephen King, Maine, old person logic and reasoning. The supernatural element kind of comes into play later in the story, and it brings an element of beauty and peace. So previous stories have used supernatural elements for terror and fear and horror. The Reach uses them in the opposite to bring a true sense of serenity and peace and beauty. Like the ending to Night Shift, which was a story called The Woman in the Room, The Reach made me cry. Like truly a fantastic and touching way to end this very, very eclectic collection. And I give The Reach 10 out of 10. Great beginning to the collection with The Mist, great ending with The Reach. It was done really well. So like I said, Skeleton Crew is another indispensable collection. It contains a few misfires and a couple of pieces like the poems that don't make much of an impact, but the overall quality of the collection is quite high, in my opinion. The diversity of pieces, styles, themes, and settings reflects the huge leap forward in Stephen King's work in the late 70s and early 80s. It includes The Mist, like I've talked about over and over in this video, which has since been published as a standalone work. And I think it could have, at the time, been published as a novel in its own right, held its own against Firestarter, against Dead Zone, against Cujo, against all the things from that era. But it's not. It's just part of this longer collection, which really brings tremendous value. So finally, ratings. We're going to talk about ratings. Overall, I give Skeleton Crew, out of a possible 220 points, Skeleton Crew earns 161, which is an overall score of 73, an average of 73. If you take the poems out of the ratings, the score is 154 out of 200, or an average of 77. But again, leave the poems in, and Skeleton Crew has an average score of 73, which is slightly less than Night Shift, but still very, very respectable. And I didn't do this when I did my You Like It Darker video because I wasn't thinking along those lines at the time, but I did go back and tally up all my scores for the stories in that collection. That has far fewer stories, and it gets a score of 86 out of 120 for an average final score of 72. So just in comparison, Skeleton Crew is a notch above You Like It Darker, and Night Shift so far is the highest rated collection that I've talked about up to this point. So if you've stuck with me this whole video, I really, really appreciate it. I appreciate your time. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about Skeleton Crew? Do you agree with my ratings? What's your favorite story in Skeleton Crew? What's your least favorite? Which do you think is the most underrated? Which of my low scores do you feel deserves a higher score? Let me know all the things. Put them in the comments. But finally, as always, thank you so much to you for your ongoing support. And wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a great rest of your day. You take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you later. Bye.